Nō mai, haere mai, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Russian forces are accelerating their advance in Ukraine, while Ukraine is crying out for more Western help. All this just a month out from the return to the White House of Donald Trump, who says he can end the war in one day. Will he bring a quick peace or spark global conflict? Welcome, Robert.
Miranda, Bruce. Thank you.
How could US President-elect Trump end the Ukraine-Russia war in one day?
Well, that's a good question. I think we have to be guarded about Mr. Trump's campaign rhetoric. He hasn't come up with a detailed plan yet. We will know more when he appoints his special envoy to Ukraine and the ambassador to Ukraine. At the moment, we have to speculate. It's very difficult to see how Mr. Trump can do what he said he's going to do without Mr. Zelensky making huge territorial concessions. In other words, what Mr. Trump has been hinting at, and it was pointed, by the way, Bruce, that during the campaign he pointedly refused to answer questions whether he would support Ukraine winning the war. For many people, this is a disturbing thing because Ukraine is the victim of an unprovoked aggression. And a neighbour, Russia, has seized 19% of Ukraine's territory. Mr. Trump's plan seems to be freezing the lines of conflict where they are and now and presiding over some sort of land for peace deal.
Right. So can I ask then, because clearly right at the moment Russia is trying to grab as much land as possible to strengthen its position when Trump comes in, if there are any sort of peace negotiations. But can Trump force a peace deal that makes Ukraine cede land to Russia?
No. And there's several things there. First of all, it's not politically viable for Zelensky to agree such a deal. And there's also the Kursk factor. Over the last few months, Ukraine has seized quite a chunk of Russia, Kursk, part of the Kursk region, and Russia, despite using North Korean troops as well as Russian troops, has failed to dislodge the Ukrainians. So that, in a sense, has changed any negotiation. I mean, Zelensky would be quite within his right saying that and he said this publicly. He said he has no intention of staying there, but he would be happy to give up Kursk if Russia withdraws back to the internationally recognised borders of Russia. So, in a sense, that was a shrewd move from a negotiating point of view. There's also rumours that another counteroffensive may occur shortly, and that was certainly quite reliable rumours. Because they've come from Ukrainian sources, particularly their military commander. So we'll have to wait and see on that. But I think Zelensky it wouldn't be viable for, too many people have died, for Zelensky to simply say, oh yes, you can keep the gains of your illegal invasion. It's also destabilising internationally, as we've discussed before, if Russia's allowed to keep this. I mean, certainly not in New Zealand's interest for that to happen. But I think there's another factor here which we're overlooking. Yes, Russia is making gradual gains, albeit at tremendous cost. Sometimes Russia is losing between 1,000 to 1,500 troops a day. We're neglecting the home front when assessing this situation. The Russian economy is now showing really severe signs of strain. The ruble, the devaluation of the ruble is relentless. It's now 113 rubles to a dollar, and yesterday alone it devalued by 7. So this is a real factor. Inflation is 9.1%, and the interest rate set by the Russian central bank is 21%. So the Russian economy is rapidly declining. And, there's an old saying that the army feeds on its stomach, or marches on its stomach, I should say. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of what is the strategic factor, which is, can Russia continue to finance this occupation and attempted annexation of Ukraine. And there are signs the Putin regime is being openly criticised now by a number of people about the catastrophic state of the Russian economy. And the US has made this much worse. In the last 7 days, the US Treasury sanctioned Gazprom Bank, as well as a host of other key financial institutions in Russia. And we've seen the ruble plunge even further since then. So this is an equation we should not lose sight of.
Right. So how long would Ukraine have to hold out then?
Well, it's very difficult to predict. Authoritarian states are not particularly transparent. There was a very revealing piece written in a US publication called National Interest by someone called Frederick Starr. And he said this aspect of the campaign or the struggle, everybody's concentrating on the front lines naturally, but this is a key strategic aspect. And there's 2 countries at the moment that could absolutely sink Putin, and one of them's India and the other one's China. They're both buying 90%, 94% of Russia's oil exports. If they could be persuaded by the United States or other actors such as Europe, that could change the situation.
Do you actually think that that's a possibility?
No, I don't.
Right.
But I'm just saying that theoretically that's a source of pressure. They could be sweeteners for either China or India to stop their buying. Effectively, that could collapse the Russian economy.
So if they're unlikely to change their position and we're anticipating that perhaps the US is going to cut back on its support, or are we? Are we guessing that's going to happen?
That's the other great thing, you see, because Mr. Trump is very unpredictable. And in a sense, Biden has preempted Trump's plans. And Zelensky has as well. Zelensky seized the Kursk, and that, in a sense, preempted a negotiation, the sort of negotiation the Trump people had in mind. Secondly, I think it's fair to say that Mr. Biden because North Korean troops are now involved on Russia's side, they have finally, after much demands from the Ukrainian side, agreed to enable Ukraine to use long-range missiles, ATACMS, as they're called. And also the British and the French have done the same, which is they made Storm Shadows on the British side and Scalps, as they're called, on the French side available. Again, we're just beginning to see the effects of that, and some of the effects are already devastating on Russian position. And another incurious thing is that a recently appointed Trump official, who's an assistant to the president, just appointed in the last 24 hours, said Russia cannot fight this war and expect to have a sanctuary. That is to say, they can't expect to invade another country and be immune to the consequences at home. So the Trump picture is unpredictable. And I wouldn't put it beyond the ability of Mr. Zelensky to manipulate Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump's very vulnerable to flattery. And the question is Putin's position objectively weakening? And we also don't know what sort of hold Mr. Putin seems to have over Mr. Trump. So there's a number of factors there. It's unknown. What we do know, and we can say, it's a very uncertain situation.
Do we think, because people are talking about, is this the start of a much, an enlarged conflict? Do you think that Putin would push the nuclear war button to avoid losing?
No. Mr. Putin has used the nuclear saber rhetoric for a long time. And he threatened nuclear war even before he began his special military operation, as he called it, in Ukraine, for those who interfered with it or supported Ukraine. He hinted that he might use nuclear weapons with the introductions of various weapons, such as the Javelin, and then the F-16s. And each time, those red lines have been crossed and nothing has happened. China has also made it clear to Mr. Putin on a number of occasions that nuclear weapons can't be used in any circumstances in Ukraine. And the declining Russian economy makes Russia even more dependent on Chinese support. So they're not really in a position to have an argument with China over this. The other thing is that recently Mr. Putin, and the reason why people are talking along these lines now, is because Mr. Putin recently adjusted Russian nuclear doctrine to include retaliating against countries which are non-nuclear but supported by nuclear powers. That hit the headlines, and it was followed by the much publicised use of a ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, which had a conventional warhead but can have nuclear warheads. So obviously that's raised the temperature a bit, but the fact of the matter is the purpose is political, as it was in previous occasions, because Mr. Putin wants to frighten the West into not supporting Ukraine. And many Ukrainian observers saying that this nuclear threat is in direct proportion to the pain that the Russians are now experiencing through their invasion. So, Mr. Putin is trying to get the West to back off from supporting. By the way, and we didn't mention this in the earlier point, but it's relevant, Starmer and Mr. Macron, the British UK leader, and the French leader are in talks about possible French and British troops being in Ukraine, which is, again, indicating to the Trump administration, I think the message is as much to the Trump administrations that the Europeans will not be countenance to any sellout deal to the Ukrainians.
Thinking about the wider implications for a moment, Trump's peace plan, could that embolden China to try and force the reunification of Taiwan with mainland China?
If Mr. Putin is rewarded for his aggression, for his illegal occupation and annexation of close to 20% of Ukraine, China may well think this is a good time since the West rolled over and accepted that. And we are talking about the flagrant violation of the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity here, which are part of the UN Charter. If the West rolls over, accepts that violation of the UN Charter, then that could embolden China to press its long-standing claim on Taiwan. One of the interesting things which we've touched on already, Bruce, I won't labour the point, is that two key actors in our neck of the woods, the Indo-Pacific, are helping the Putin regime. And by implication, if Putin is defeated, it will have big implications for them in the Indo-Pacific, and not least China. It's really, at the moment, this whole talk about AUKUS, Judith Collins recently made a speech in which she urged New Zealand businesses, high-tech businesses, to prepare for an international situation which she said was dire. And New Zealand is thinking about participating in Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which is all about sharing of defence technology. But actually, the real issue is the ongoing war. And China's assertiveness could increase if Putin wins. So New Zealand has a huge stake, not just talking to businesses about how they should prepare, but actually helping the effort to defeat Putin. We've given about 130 million in humanitarian and military assistance since Russia began its full-scale invasion in February 2022. That pales into significance with Australia and countries like Canada, countries we like to compare ourselves with. So there is a case that the current government should be looking very hard at doing everything possible, particularly with the apparent wobbling that's going on in Washington with the advent of the Trump administration, to do more to defeat Mr. Putin, because we have a big stake in security in the Indo-Pacific, and two countries in the Indo-Pacific are supporting Mr. Putin.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight for a look back at the highs and lows of global affairs in this past year. Noho ora mai.